Hey there, Scott here from SocialNRG Presents, and thank you so much for joining us. We've got a wonderful episode here for you to enjoy, especially if you're a big fan of incredible jazz music. Our guest today is the incomparable Laila Biali, an internationally acclaimed multi-award-winning Canadian singer-songwriter, pianist, and national radio host who's headlined major music festivals and venues spanning 5 continents. Laila has worked with countless artists over the years, most notably touring with music legends Chris Botti, Paula Cole, and Suzanne Vega, and she's also recorded with and supported international icon Sting as one of his backup singers. And today, Laila joins us from her home outside of Toronto for a look back at her successes and to bring us up to speed on what she's working on next. So sit back, relax, and get ready as SocialNRG now presents you with your Backstage Pass.
Are you still recording through all this COVID stuff? Are you doing virtual stuff?
Yeah. So I mean, in full disclosure, I think we're a little burnt out on live streams, which require a different level of technical support. But I married not only my drummer, but an engineer, a studio engineer and producer. So in our basement, we have a fairly fully equipped studio, and Ben will just run the cables upstairs to where our little upright piano is, and he'll set us up for whatever we need to record. I've actually even recorded a few singles since pandemic hit, just
Really?
within our own home studio environment. So I feel very fortunate.
So What do you do? Do you fly other players in over the internet type of thing?
You know what? No. So as you well know, it's like lockdown has kind of been in varying stages since pandemic, hit in March in Canada. So there have been times where we were allowed to have a physically distanced bassist in our living room wearing a mask.
Oh no!
So,
what I meant was, well, if you actually because I've been doing sessions at my home where people are doing vocals and things like that remotely, and I bring them in and fly them into the session.
Yes. So we do that as well, but everything, it's not in real time. So in other words, we'll send somebody tracks and then they'll record their part from their home studio to our track that we send them. And then my husband, who's also a mix engineer, he'll collate it all, put it all together, and we'll have a new, Quarantunes video performance, or we'll have a new track.
Quarantunes. I love it.
Quarantunes.
I love it.
You trademarked that, right?
Right, exactly. No, you know what? Someone else got to it before me, and I just scooped it up as my own. After seeing it, I sort of co-opted the term because I thought it was so great. It kind of encapsulates this moment in history.
Yeah,
that begs a record. Quarantunes 2020.
Quarantunes. I know. Right, exactly. I don't know if people are going to want to hear once we're beyond this. I keep thinking, how much are people going to want to hear about it as this, unique period in history that we don't want to really think about, but it's a reality, and it has informed the way our music is taking shape and the way our lives have taken shape. So, it's kind of there.
It'd be like people that used to talk about the Great Depression and the Second World War and stuff. You listen. I lived through the Great Pandemic.
Right.
I'm not long for the rocking chair things to destroy my grandkids myself. So, I was going to say. So, it's interesting. There's some friends of mine. Have you heard of Session Wire?
No.
Session Wire, it was invented by a company in Vancouver, and it's actually where you can record no matter what platform you're on. If you're on Cakewalk, if you're on Pro Tools, if you're on Logic, whatever you're using, and everybody can actually record in real time.
Wow. Jane,
I don't know how they do it, because there's got to be latency, but for somehow it works.
Well, so Jane Ira Bloom, the saxophonist, she's kind of an avant-garde saxophonist. So, case in point, that works just fine. It's her and a bassist, and they did a whole album in real time, virtually. But of course, it's all, kind of meandering, out of time, free jazz. So the latency matters less when that's the case. As soon as you want a pulse or groove of any kind, I think it's really difficult to have everybody sync, the way that they would in an environment together.
Well, you remember Mark, our drummer that we played with at the Toronto
Yes.
Jazz Festival. Well, Mark and I
Yes.
have a regular band away from Randy Bachman as well. So we had this tribute act that we had called Atlantic Crossing, and we were doing it. We are going to perform at Blue Frog Studios, but it was going to be done
Oh,
pay-per-view,
yeah.
pay-per-view. So, but here's the thing. So we're trying to rehearse because we hadn't played in all these months. So I found this thing online. Everybody downloads it. Well, the problem is the latency. So you start the
Yeah.
song, and what happens? You hear Mark, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Right.
And it's like it's just going downhill. It's like playing with the world's worst drummer, right? The song starts at 120, and within a bar, it's 90.
Right. Yeah.
Just,
Yeah.
it was almost impossible to rehearse. But I was going to say, talking about drummers, when I saw you play in Vancouver, and of course you're wonderful, and I knew that, but I was so amazed at how great your husband is on drums. He's the most creative guy. Like how he uses cymbals is not like he'll use basic parts of the drums, but use them in backwards ways that are so creative. He's a
Yeah,
really
that's
brilliant guy.
Oh, I will pass along that compliment to him. I think that's a little bit what he's known for is this kind of hybrid of percussion and drums and not using drums in a conventional way. I mean, of course he plays this, a drum kit, a standard drum kit, but he dresses up that kit in myriad ways. And let me tell you, Mick, when we went to make our first album together, we were still living in Brooklyn. And I have a photo. I have to send it to you, or I'll have to post it so folks can see it. But the entire lobby of our building was filled with his various trinkets and percussion. And like it was insane the amount of gear he brought. And, it's the kind of thing where you had to get like a huge van to put it all into.
A U-Haul truck.
Exactly. And the thing is, I would always look at him skeptically, like, you're not going to use all that stuff. You don't need to bring house and home to the studio or, but he would, and he would use it all. And of course, when we tour together, when we're not in a global pandemic and we're on the road, we would have extra suitcases we would have to bring on the plane so he could have all his doodads.
Wow. Well, I mean, that's what he does. And it's like, why sell it short? I mean, it is what it is. But yeah, and another thing too, it's like, and his drumming lends itself to this. Your arrangements of like cover songs, like the way you stretch them and pull them backwards. And of course your inversion chords and all these things that you use are just so incredible. It's like, it's amazing what you turn a simple Neil Young song into, it's unbelievable.
Well, sometimes to the chagrin of Neil Young fans, right? Because I think some people love that it's a unique offering, a unique arrangement, but others, for them, the original song, the original version is sacred. And so they're like, right. Why would you, tear down and rebuild and repaint this heritage home, but I love to do it. And it's always fun when I meet people like yourself who are, ready to go on the ride together.
If it's good, it's good. You know what I mean? It's like if you listen to "Gotta Get You Into My Life" by the Beatles and "Gotta Get You Into My Life" by Earth, Wind and Fire.
Right. Sure.
Like sometimes the cover just takes it to a little help from my friends, Joe Cocker. Oh my God. Yeah. And that's Beatles, which is sacrilege to me and most people.
Yeah, sure.
Of my age group. So, but you get those moments where it's that much better. It's like,
it's like Lenny Kravitz, An American Woman.
I didn't like
it. You don't like his version? I grew up with it.
Yeah.
I really, why I didn't like that one? I mean, I thought it was okay, but to me, the signature part of that song is that guitar part. Da 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 da. That's the hook. And it's like he missed that entire hook. And I'm going, there should have been at least an homage to that, I thought. I think the whole basis of what made the song cool to me.
You raise an interesting debate a point of debate, which is, for me as an arranger, I've occasionally given talks on my process. And one of the things I always share is that for me, because you are really at the end of the day, you're trying to honor the person who wrote the song, right? The original songwriter. And so I always look for some of that raw material that really gives the song its original character and transpose that into whatever it is that I do. So, I do an arrangement of Coldplay's Yellow, and their version has this like pedaling kind of driving guitar, and it's through the whole song. And I thought, well, this is going to be a jazz piano trio playing this song. How do I do that? But and so I had this pedal point, and I changed where it was in the piano, and it sounded almost a little bit like something Chopin wrote, the Raindrop Prelude. But that was my way of paying tribute to this kind of hooky driving guitar pedal. So yeah, I hear what you're saying, Mick.
Yeah, but yet on the same token, I mean, here's the thing, Scott, to give you full credit too, is that "Gotta Get You Into My Life" by the Beatles, the hook line with the horns is going da 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 da. That never happens in the Earth, Wind and Fire stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that is ever enters their arrangement. They changed it totally backwards, but it worked for some reason. It's like it was almost like its own song.
Do you find when you're doing arrangements of covers and all that too, you find you're writing for a new audience to introduce them to this older music through a different versioning of it or imagining of it?
Are you asking me, Scott?
Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Yes.
No, I mean, my brain is in a million places right now because I was just thinking about, and maybe this ties in with your question, so for me, I was born in 1980. And I think of a song, an iconic song like "I Will Always Love You."
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, the quintessential version, and it was the only version to my ear, was Whitney Houston's. And then to discover retroactively, or retrospectively, Dolly Parton's version, it was this amazing delight, and it just added a whole new layer to the song for me, and even brought kind of a new dimension to the way that Whitney did it. So what was your question again, to make sure I actually answered it?
When you do a song like that, where you're going to put your own spin to an existing piece, do you have in your mind that the audience you're writing this for is actually a newer, younger audience that wasn't around when that original piece was done, so that you're trying to reintroduce it in your own flair? Or,
well, I hate to date my audiences, but the truth is, as a jazz musician, a lot of my listeners are a little bit older, often a decade or two or even more older than I am. So, but I do think about, the music that I'm attracted to from kind of the more mainstream realm. And I would say that, like, for example, what we did with Coldplay's Yellow, that did seem to particularly strike a chord with some younger listeners. But I guess for me, it's not even so much about generation, it's more about genre. And for me as a jazz musician, or a musician with jazz foundations, it's exciting to kind of explore this space between jazz and something other. And I want to challenge my listeners, my audience, who are in large part jazz fans, to kind of delve into, other corners of jazz or subgenres that stretch what the definition of jazz is.
Right.
Well, yeah, you become quite a conduit when you think of it, because it's terrible to say, because it's not really true, and I know that in my heart. But jazz has a tendency to have an older listening audience. It's a more sophisticated style of music,
right?
And so if you can bridge a song like "Yellow," which is something they'd never heard, or if they did hear it, they might have turned the station, because they'd want to be listening to what they want. So if you can take that song, put it into their realm, and all of a sudden, so the young kids are going, "Hey, this is cool," and they might listen to something that's more trad, and then the older listeners would go, "Wow, this is cool. What song is this?" And the grandkids go, "Well, that's Coldplay, Grandpa."
Exactly.
And you know what I mean? So.
Exactly. And by, I think you said this in a way, you're also bringing jazz, like a jazz interpretation of a pop song to listeners who probably wouldn't call themselves jazz fans. And they unwittingly are becoming jazz fans, you know, because you've given them something familiar to sink their teeth into. And I think that that's critical because jazz, it used to be the pop music of its day. It was the party music, you know, and now, you know, it's sort of developed this kind of stuffy reputation, but it's really not that at all. And it can even, I think, especially with institutionalized jazz, it can become kind of like alienating to the listener, to your average listener, right? Like if you're not in the in club and you don't understand all the sophisticated harmony, then you almost have no right to be here, and people will feel excluded. And I have wanted so much to kind of crack things back open again and invite mainstream listeners back to the table, because jazz is meant to be enjoyed by anyone and everyone.
It could be intimidating, you know. That's the thing. Is that I brought this up before. I can't remember who I was talking to, but I remember when I did the jazz tour with Randy. And Randy's whole thing was he always wanted to pay homage to Lenny Breau, who was his guitar. You know, the great Lenny Breau. Everybody talks about. I mean, he was just one of the best guitarists that's ever been on the planet. Yeah. Randy took lessons from him. He's always wanted to say. You know, I've always, that was Randy's principal teacher. That's where he wrote Undone and all that stuff from. Was all his Lenny Breau lessons. Man. So before I started working with Randy, he was recording this jazz album with a bunch of jazz cats. So in 2004, we went out on tour and I played that thing. I'd never played jazz before, and I'd never played that thing before either. And my very first show was playing that thing on live at the rehearsal hall on Bravo. First time ever playing it is on a live. Oh God! Anyway, so regardless, we played at the top of the Senator in Toronto. And of course, the next day you see the write-ups come in. And of course, the write-up is from this jazz guy who basically pans the whole thing because how dare Randy Bachman do this? He's a rock guy, he's not a jazz guy. And that's the problem, is the intimidation factor. Instead of saying, hey, welcome to the club, nice try, buddy, you know, or whatever.
100%.
You know, instead of just slapping them down, you know.
100%. And I have struggled, you know, with even my place in jazz, because I've always been attracted to and loved, you know, what we call more pop music, you know, and I've often felt kind of guilty about that as a jazz musician, or embarrassed, you know, to say to my peers and listeners, like, well, actually my 10-year-old son and I, we listened to Katy Perry and Taylor Swift, you know, because people would always they'd poo-poo the pop music, as if it was like just not sophisticated. It's only 4 chords, but there's a craft to it as well, right? And it is a craft that I think demands our respect, no matter how trained one is as a musician.
Your son's name is Josh, right?
Josh, yeah.
And did you just say he's 10?
He's 10.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I can't believe it's been that long since we worked together. Because I mean, I think he was barely older than a toddler, I think, when I worked with you.
Is he your roadie?
Not old.
He's your roadie?
Yeah, I mean, you know what? He's quite the strapping young man. My husband and I were just looking at him the other day going, what happened? Like, he's just shot up. So I'm hoping that he will be a roadie, or at least, or maybe in the band at some point.
Yeah, well, it definitely comes from that genetic code, you know. There's no doubt.
Like it or not.
And speaking of which, I got to get back to that. So how does somebody become like you? I want to get into your story, how you become this jazz performer in a world that, mind you, it's opening up. I mean, there's Esmeralda Spalding and all these great women jazz players, you know, not to mention Diana Krall, of course. And there always has been great women jazz singers, from the Ella Fitzgeralds and, you know, Billie Holidays, whatever, all this stuff down the road. But now it's the instrumentalists as well.
Yeah.
And so I got to get back to your story. So you were born in North Vancouver, correct?
Lionsgate Hospital, North Vancouver.
Okay, and so tell me about your parents. Let's go back there.
Yeah, so my parents are both from other countries. So my mom is from Germany and my dad is from Egypt. And they met on Kitsilano Beach in Vancouver. If I recall the story, my mom was walking in the sand in her high heels, and my dad spotted her, and he was like, "That's the woman for me."
Yeah.
And and so they courted and married, and they had my sister. I have three elder sisters, and I grew up in Vancouver, among the mountains and the sea, which I miss every day out here in Ontario. And it's interesting. My family is musical, but nobody really pursued music really seriously. Between my siblings and I was sort of the first. And my mom loves to tell the story of how I was 3.5, and of course I was watching Sesame Street probably almost every day, and I climbed up onto the piano bench and tried to play the melody to Sesame Street by ear. And this is back in the days when parents didn't enroll their kids in every extracurricular activity you could think of. They chose one. And so she was like, okay, well, this kid obviously likes music and is drawn, so we'll put her in lessons. And so off I went to my first and only classical music teacher's house. Juanita Ryan was her name. She's still alive. And what I can tell you about Juanita, she was this very fiery Italian woman. And she had a daughter who was a little older than I, and her daughter had this spectacular porcelain doll collection, which was in this room leading up to the piano room. So I would sort of pass by those porcelain dolls every day and gawk at them. And into the music room I would go, and we used the Leila Fletcher method, which was largely like arts and crafts. I was cutting out music notes and keys on the piano, which for a kid who was 4 was just kind of the right introduction to music. It was very tactile. And of course I was at the piano as well. But it didn't take long for me to really fall in love with piano. And, in those days, so in the 80s, I don't know many teachers who were training young students in classical and other genres. It was just classical once we started really, training at the piano. But it just so happened that I loved classical music. My mom was always playing CBC Radio 2. It was always in the background in the house, which at that time was exclusively classical. And so it was in my ear. And before too long, I would go to bed at night with my cassette tapes. You remember those? I had my cassette tapes of Arthur Rubinstein playing Chopin's nocturnes and preludes. And I would imagine myself playing these really advanced classical piano pieces, and delighting listeners the way that those songs delighted me. I mean, they would fill me with emotions I couldn't even describe at that age. It was just this, like I would be lifted up by the music, kind of spiritually, and I didn't understand what that was, but it was the best feeling in the world, and I never wanted to let go of it.
Well, that's a fantastic thing, because there's so many times that you hear, especially guitar players, where they get piano lessons and they hate it, but they, you know what I mean? And so that's where they end up going to guitar. But in your situation, you plunked a little Sesame Street melody. Your mother goes, she seems to have an ear for music. Get her into lessons. And it was an instant connection.
Yeah.
Like it actually was exactly the avenue you needed to go down.
Yes.
So where are you at with the siblings, ages and is it
I'm
all
the
girls?
youngest. I'm the baby. My parents had me because they wanted a boy. I was their sort of fourth kick at the can, and they had a name picked out for me and everything. I was going to be called Mark, but out I came, another girl, number 4. So my eldest sister Susan, she's a doctor and dancer and speaker. And then my second eldest, Tanya, not my second eldest, the second eldest sister. She now goes by Nia. She's a painter. And then Vanessa, who's the second youngest, is in Calgary. And she's in the oil and gas industry. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
And I'm the baby.
Wow, isn't that cool? So was your dad raised in Egypt?
He was. He grew up in Egypt. I believe he spent some time studying in Germany, and so he actually spoke a bit of German. And his mom, I'm quite sure his mom was German. I wish I was more connected with my extended family. His mom died long before I was born, so
Mm.
never met her, never saw any photos. But they actually came to Canada together, initially to Saskatchewan. So my dad is an engineer.
It's interesting you talk about your mom wearing high heels on the beach. My when I've been in Europe, and especially like I spent a lot of time in Poland. And it's amazing. Women in Poland will take 2 hours getting ready to walk across the street to buy a quart of milk. I'm not exaggerating. They are impeccably dressed. Like I remember Brent Knudsen and I in my band, when we first started playing in Poland, we used to play games called, and sorry for being crass, we used to call it Spot the Ugly Chick.
Right.
And because you couldn't.
Yeah.
You couldn't. Everywhere you went in Poland, the women were dressed to the nines. They all looked perfect, and they all looked like fashion models walking around. And every so often, you'd see a woman that wasn't all that attractive, and as you got closer, you realized she was from the States or Canada.
Right.
Because she'd be dressed in a tracksuit like most women would be in North America.
Yes, it's so funny you should say that, because my band, who I call my boys affectionately, they love to tour with me in Poland. I've played there a couple times, and I'll never forget it. We got picked up from the airport, and we had, an artist liaison with us, and her name was Marta. Yeah. And she was like this Barbie doll, and she was very petite. It was cold. It was late November in Poland. It is not warm there that time of year. And she wore these like little, kind of go-go boots and a little short skirt. And what was amazing to me was that, not only was she just this, sort of cute as a button, she could kick butt when she needed to get the job done, whether it was lugging all my heavy stuff up the winding stairs to the green room, which was upstairs, like on the third floor of this old building. She would just do it herself. She was so tough. And so it was that interesting mix of like this sort of almost stereotypical beauty, but then like real toughness and grit.
Polish women notoriously are very, very strong-willed and very strong. But you got to realize that the men were off getting the living crap kicked out of them in the wars. The women ran everything. Yeah. So they really are. Mark married a Polish girl. Mark, actually, the very first night we played in Poland, he met his future wife, and her name is
kidding.
Yeah, and her name is Dorota, which is Polish for it's like Dorothy.
Right.
So of course, Fred Turner, we were touring with Bachman and Turner. He could never get her name right. He could never he could never get Dorota right. He finally he kept calling her Dorito.
Oh no! And she's more than a nacho.
And it just got to the point where Dorota just go, oh whatever, okay, I'm Dorito. But of course, everybody in those European blocks, I mean, I think Dorota speaks like 4 languages, and like
it's extraordinary.
Yeah,
it's extraordinary.
It's a whole different thing. And also going back to your dad, I remember I did an army thing and I went to Cairo, and I think that we went to Egypt, but I remember going to Cairo because they brought us to the pyramids and all that sort of stuff. But I remember going to Cairo, and Cairo, the city of Cairo has almost the population of Canada in it. It's a massive, massive city. I counted 1 traffic light. 1. They are nuts there. I've never seen such a mess of traffic and accidents, cars pulled over, smashed against, and just left there.
Wow.
It's the most incredible place. And then we were supposed to go play. Sorry, I'm off on a tangent, but it's kind of a worthwhile story. We're supposed to go play up in the Sinai Peninsula for the troops. There's 5,000 troops up in the Sinai Peninsula, about 10 miles away from the Gaza Strip. Now, they said we can't travel at night. So I'm thinking, well, probably because there was Al-Qaeda and all that stuff. through there, which is true. There is Al Qaeda all the way along that whole thing. You know, there's armed guards helping you and all this stuff and giving you escorts as you're going up by bus. But the real reason why is because Egyptians don't like to use the headlights on their cars at night because it might wear them out. So you're driving and you won't even see the cars.
Oh my gosh.
It's such a bizarre country. It really is a bizarre country.
Well, you know, you're shedding some light on why he became an engineer, I suppose. Maybe he saw the need was great. That's incredible.
Yeah, but it was a great trip. Anyway, okay, I got to get back to this. So you're playing classical music, and how does that evolve into a jazz style? Where does the jazz thing come in? Oh, by the way, so you started playing piano when you were 3 or 4?
Yeah, so just casually 3.5, and then officially, you know, formally in lessons at 4. Yeah, so I was young. But the funny thing, Mick, is that, you know, I've since met other people who did the Suzuki method as violinists and piano as well. And they start when they're like 2. So I thought I was young, but apparently I wasn't that young compared to, you know,
the violins are this big.
I mean, it's really extraordinary. So yeah, how I came to jazz is this very interesting story. It's a sad story that ultimately has a silver lining. So I was an aspiring concert pianist. I actually, you know, my heroes were Evgeny Kissin and, you know, all these incredible contemporary concert pianists. And Evgeny especially stuck out for me because he was young. He was relatively young. He's a great Russian pianist. And I remember seeing him at the Orpheum Theater, and I was young, and, you know, you get dressed up and you go to this plush, decadent, gorgeous theater, and everyone's very polite. And it's, you know, there's drama to the whole experience. Yes. And then, of course, the music. So I wanted to be a concert pianist. But when I was 15, we were on a trip down to Seattle, which was where we would do all our shopping. You know, growing up in Vancouver, we would go south of the border, where my dad would buy like his electronics, and, you know, and we would go shopping at Bellevue Center, and we always loved that so much as kids. And so lots of fun memories attached to those trips. But one fateful trip, we were rear-ended on the highway. So we were, you know, going like 100 kilometers or more an hour. And the car in front of us stopped very suddenly. My dad stopped just in time, just short of hitting the person in front of us. And then the person behind us stopped in time, but the person behind them didn't catch it. So they actually bumped that car into us. But the impact was great enough that our car was a write-off, and I was sitting in the back, and I had really bad whiplash. And it was that, in combination with a couple of other bizarre events. We were doing push-up tests at school. Like when I was back in school the following week, I had this huge piano competition I was a part of where, you know, the adjudicator was from Juilliard, and that was where I wanted to go to school. You know, years later, that was the dream. So I'm practicing and I'm doing these push-ups at school, and there was this accident, the whiplash, and I was playing the shaker in our high school big band. And I just remember my arm seizing up on me, and I was like, uh-oh. And that was the beginning of what, you know, after like years of tests and treatments, we essentially diagnosed as repetitive strain injury. But I have no doubt that it related to that initial accident, because I always had this uncomfortable feeling in my right shoulder, and it would sort of refer down my arm all the way to my hand. And so that was a turning point. I could not play these ambitious, high-level classical concert pieces anymore. I didn't have the facility. So I started playing all these left-hand pieces. You would be shocked how many left-handed pieces are out there. Like Ravel wrote a lot for just left-handed piano. There's some left-handed piano concertos, but it just wasn't the same. It was not the same. I was trying, but I was like bleeding on the inside, you know. And it just so happened that I was introduced to jazz by my high school teacher, Bob Rebliati, at the same time that this accident happened and my dreams of becoming a concert pianist were dashed. And so jazz kind of, it almost showed up, if you could say that classical piano was like my first love. That's just my husband in the background there. That's Ben.
Hey, man.
Jazz came along as like, the first person you date after you break up with your first love. And so I was like not into jazz at all because I was still grieving classical. And they felt so different from one another. But over time, my teacher, Bob Rebliati, he had taught Rini Rosnes, this incredible jazz pianist who went to the same high school a couple decades before me. And he recognized that the worlds of classical and jazz had to find a place where they would intersect in order for me to make sense of jazz. So he helped me bridge that gap by turning me on to Rini Rosnes's music. She had a robust classical background as well. Chick Corea, God rest his soul.
No kidding.
Yeah, absolutely.
Keith Jarrett, all these piano players who fully inhabited the world of jazz, but you could hear the classical influence in their playing. And so that just helped me connect with jazz, and it helped me recognize that the two worlds were not so divorced, contrary to what I had been told.
Am I way off base by saying that classical music, it seemed like you get people like Rick Wakeman and stuff who are obviously classically trained. It seemed to bridge to rock better than it bridged to jazz.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Gosh, I mean, I'll tell you that I was talking earlier about how snobby jazz musicians can be, if you'll forgive me saying that. And it's really funny, rewind a few decades and classical musicians were so sort of uppity and snobby towards jazz that Keith Jarrett, when he went to, did he go to Berkeley? I think he went to Berkeley, but it was like pianists, Rini Rosnes, same thing. If you were a jazz piano player or a classical player who, God forbid, dabbled in jazz, you weren't allowed to play jazz on the classical piano. They designated certain concert grands within the program classical pianos, and it was as though you would somehow mar the piano if you played jazz on it, which to me is just so ludicrous, but it shows you how huge that divide was not that long ago. So maybe that's why jazz or classical, I mean, I would think classical and rock would be an even bigger divide. So I don't know what that's about, Mick, but
it's interesting. That reminds me of, when people say, hey, you got a guitar? When you're young, you got a guitar? Yeah. Can I see it? And actually, older people still say this to this day. Can I see your guitar? Yeah. Hey, is that a lead guitar or a rhythm guitar? Right? Like they think there's a specific guitar for lead and a specific, not really. Now, here's something. I brought this up before. Maybe you might know this because you've been schooled and you've been in this. There's left-handed instruments, but there's no left-handed piano.
Right.
And I often wonder, like a guy like Paul McCartney who's left-handed, does that make his left hand more advanced than the regular left hand? Like my left hand is like sausage fingers, right? On the keyboard. It's terrible.
I think so. You have to trying to kind of accomplish an ambidextrous facility at the piano, I think is kind of built into.
Well, that's where the hand exercises come in, right?
Well, that's it, right? Exactly. Yeah. But there's no doubt that you can identify anybody, especially when it comes to like ragtime and boogie woogie. It's like if somebody has that powerful left hand, or like someone like Oscar Peterson, or Paul McCartney, it's like, the way that they approach the left hand of the piano, I think is probably more involved, more rigorous than your average player. Even though I think we're all trained to try to give that left hand, an equal measure of attention.
Right. How old were you when that accident happened, by the way?
I was 15. So we're
my God. So
really
right,
like
just on the cusp.
Exactly.
Oh my God. How heartbreaking.
It was.
Oh,
I mean,
Jesus.
it led to depression for me. And so not only did I have to fight the injury itself, but I had to fight, this sort of mental strain and anguish, which is already at its heights when you're an angsty teenager.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. So you discover jazz and it gets bridged. And so now what happens from there? Did you ever play in a pop band, or were you always, was your first band like a jazz band?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
okay.
So I, so did the classical thing, which was always solo. Rarely was I playing with any other musicians when in the classical realm. And then with jazz, yeah, it was, playing in the big band and in small band ensembles and getting used to this idea of improvising, which was terrifying to me and still a little bit terrifying. And then, as I went off to college, it became very clear to me that while I was able to get some gigs as a jazz musician, especially after I moved to New York City, which happened in my mid-20s, it became very clear to me that I was going to have to become versed in other genres, and that wasn't a difficult thing because like I said, I've always loved other styles of music. I was already listening to other styles of music. I was listening to Bjork and Radiohead and Lenny Kravitz, who you mentioned
Yeah.
earlier. And and I guess, classical musicians were often criticized for not being able to like establish a good pocket at the piano, right? Like very
Right.
often classical musicians are criticized for not being able to play with good time.
Right.
But I think because I loved and favored mainstream forms of music. I hate calling it that, but you know what I mean, for all intents and purposes. That pocket for me was there and the vocabulary was there. I think for what was a barrier though, Mick, and I had to overcome it very quickly when I got put into Paula Cole's band, which is where I met my husband. When I when I was put in her band, I had to learn how to play a proper synth and keyboard, like where you're programming all these sounds and you've got the keyboard going and you've got the piano going at the same time. And do you recall at the gig with Randy Bachman at Toronto Jazz Fest that I was on a Nord, and
Yes.
it's just to tell you how like non-keyboardy I am. I
Yeah.
remember, I think it was programmed to like a Phantom of the Opera organ sound. And I sat down to play, I think it was like either, the Sade tune or whatever it was. And it was just, I came in and it was that Phantom of the Opera sound.
So Daryl had to come over and help you out, I think, didn't he? Yeah.
I couldn't even figure out how to change the sound myself. But
Well,
anyway,
don't
Was
feel
that, was
bad
that during
because
practice?
they would don't.
Sorry, was
don't
that
feel,
during practice or live?
it was
no, that was
live.
live.
Oh my gosh.
Don't feel bad, Laila, because when I would play keyboards for Randy, this back before Tal joined the band, I would play for
Yeah.
the guys and stuff, and Brent would take over the bass. I didn't know how to program the Nord. I had no clue. So Daryl got very proficient in that. It was like I'm a guy that I can pick a sound out on my computer. That's easy, but trying to go through these pages on these keyboards.
Well, that's it. And the interface on every one of them is totally different. And I had to learn. So, after I toured with Paula Cole, I toured with Suzanne Vega, and she had an equally rigorous set of keyboard patches that I had to learn and program. And the gal who had preceded me, Alison Cornell, was just like whippersnapper Swiss Army knife. I mean, she toured with, I think, Bonnie Raitt and Shania Twain, and she would fiddle and she'd play all these keyboard sounds and she'd sing and she'd play guitar. And, and she was just a wizard with the tech side of things. And for me, it's like a totally different instrument. So back to your question about playing in a band, I didn't have much experience at all outside of jazz until I joined Paula Cole's band, and then it was baptism by fire. And then after I moved to New York, I found I was actually playing more often in like kind of pop bands as opposed to jazz.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And so how did you end up working with Sting? Where did that come from? Like I did one gig with Paula Cole. It was an opening of a radio station in Winnipeg. I know.
No way.
Yeah, and she was there, and she performed, and then Randy and I performed. We just the two of us, and it was like just this. It was like just right in the studio. But yeah, so yeah, she was wonderful. Like
She's so talented.
oh yeah. And so anyway, so and by the way, I see. I thought you still lived in New York. I thought that now. When did you move back to Toronto or the Toronto area?
Fall of 2015.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so not that long after I worked with you.
I think it was before we worked together. I was
Oh,
already
really?
living. Yeah, wasn't it 2016? I feel like we played together in 2016.
Well, you're probably right. But I thought for sure you were living in New York then. I could have swore you
You
talked
know
about living
what?
in New York.
Here's the thing. I We moved in fall of 2015, lock, stock, barrel, but I was so deeply connected to the New York scene, and I had a gig working at a church down there, and they needed me to continue to like fly down every couple of weeks. And so I was still very, very enmeshed with life in the city and thought of myself really as a dual resident.
Okay.
Less so these days, especially post pandemic. I mean, it's been eons since I have been anywhere, as is the case for all of us. But yeah, to answer your question about Sting, so I was living in New York at the time. I had moved there in 2008, and Ben and I were, dating on and off again. That's my husband Ben, who I met in Paula Cole's band. And fast forward to the summer of 2009. So I'm living in New York, and as you'll so often hear from anyone who's spent any amount of time there, there's this thing we call the New York beatdown, which is that you're there in the city, you're so stimulated, you're meeting people you never dreamed of meeting. You're not only meeting them, you're working with them. You're at your local cafe having a espresso with Bashiri Johnson, who played with, Whitney Houston and Michael Jackson. And he becomes your friend because you're, shoulder to shoulder in the streets of Brooklyn. And so that's all happening. But the city also takes so much. There's like living in New York is like guerrilla conditions, right? so and the crazy thing that I think a lot of people don't talk about New York is that you're playing all these gigs and you're being paid like $50 to rehearse twice and then go play a 3-hour gig at the whatever jazz club or club in the city. And so it's really hard to make ends meet. So I'm like, going through the New York beatdown, and it's August. Actually, it might have been late July of 2009. And I called my dad up, and we're having a heart to heart. And he says, Laila, you should probably just, admit defeat, come back to Canada. You'll have healthcare again. You'll have an easier life. But I was so attached to New York. I really was. I felt like these were my people. Where had they been my whole life? And so I start really seriously considering his advice. And within a couple days, there is a voicemail on, I had a landline back then that my roommate and I shared. And she said, Laila, you might want to listen to a message that's on there for you. And so I pick up the message, and it's Lisa Fischer, who I didn't know at the time. And she's very soft-spoken, even though she wails when she's singing with Mick Jagger. She's very soft-spoken. Hi, Laila, it's Lisa Fischer. I got your name from Greg Clark. I'm putting together auditions for a project with Sting. Would you come and audition? And it was like, within a day or two that I had to go to this Midtown studio to audition. And I remember laughing and turning to my roommate, who's like, wants to know what this call is all about, right? Because she heard it too. And I think it's a joke. I actually think it's a practical joke, because it was always my dream to work with Sting. But come on, like really, really. And then I think, well, okay, for poops and giggles, I'll go and audition, but there's no way I'm going to get this gig, because it was to audition as a singer. And I hardly considered myself a singer at that time, I mean, I was singing, but it was still just always something that I had nagging doubts about. I wasn't trained as a singer. I had been criticized as a singer, you know. So off I went, and there were a bunch of us, including Lisa, of course. And we just all, you know, like it was like boot camp for singers. They had us in all these different permutations because they were trying to find a group of 4 who would sing well together. And Bob Sadin, who'd produced Sting's record, If on a Winter's Night, it's like this winter songs project, he was there producing the session. Now, knowing Sting was not there, but knowing him and how involved he is at every step of, you know, kind of any project that he's, you know, a part of, I wouldn't doubt that Bob was recording everything and sending it to Sting to have him listen.
Right.
And Bob called me that night and he said, you know, we want to bring you back. And again, I just, what? How? You know? And so I was brought back a couple of days later. I was even asked to recommend somebody. So I recommended this young gal, Jo Laurie, who went on to sing with Sting for years. And so it was me, Joe, and Lisa Fisher, and a few other people, again, just rotating, changing places and trying out all these different parts. And then, yeah, I got an email that said, we'd like you to come to Sting's villa in Tuscany.
Wow.
Just,
wow.
You know, pinch me. And it was just, the timing was extraordinary, because you go to New York City for the New York dream. And even though that dream was taking shape in like little small but significant ways, it still wasn't enough to warrant staying. I was still essentially a sinking ship. And so that opportunity came along just when I needed it. So off I went, and you know, had the time of my life. Have you met him, Mick?
I never have.
Okay. He's a total gentleman. He's, you know, he's just kind, gracious, so dedicated. And it was just the fulfillment of a dream to work with him, and we're still in touch. So he's great.
Yeah. We interviewed Jeffrey Lee Campbell, who was Sting's guitarist. He put out a book, and it was Sting's guitarist on the Nothing Like the Sun tour. So
wow.
years before, and so he did the Amnesty, all with Peter Gabriel, all that stuff back in the day. So we were talking about that, and I'd mentioned that Sting, although I've always admired him, and I have all his albums, and I you know, I listen to them like a thesis to this day. And, that I was always afraid to meet him, because I always figured he would be a nose in the air and I'd have nothing in common with him. And yet then a friend of mine who's a makeup artist in Hollywood, she said that there was a TV show where somehow she became Sting's makeup artist, and she was with him for the whole day. She says he is the sweetest, most kind person you'll ever meet in your life. Like exactly the opposite of the snob you would think he would be.
Yeah, and you know what? I think that, I mean, to be fair, I think that he was a little bit of a notorious rock musician back in his Police days. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I don't know how many of those stories that are circulating are true, but I think that, you know, after meeting and marrying Trudy and having kids, and I mean, he loves kids so much, and he's so good to his family, and he's so good to his wife. I think that, you know, he probably always was a gentleman, but all the more so as he's gotten older.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think there's a certain amount to that. I mean, I remember once again, I said this in the interview with Jeffrey. I remember seeing him, I think it was on Oprah or something like that, and he was talking about how he lives each day wanting to prove to Trudy Styler how much he loves her.
Yeah. Oh, that doesn't surprise me. So he was here with The Last Ship in 2019, and he had actually asked my husband and I if we would, you know, maybe put some jam sessions together while he was in town, which we were so excited about. They didn't come to fruition because his manager had other designs on his spare time when he was here in Toronto. But I got to go down to the theater a few times, and right there in his kind of green room, not green room, his dressing room, there's a picture of Trudy prominently displayed. I mean, I don't want to call it a shrine, but it was just like this sort of sacred area he carved out in his dressing room to honor his wife when they were away from each other. And I was like,
Yeah.
wow, that is such a powerful message.
Mm. Well,
So,
McCartney
yeah,
very much that like that with Linda. I mean,
yeah.
Linda didn't play in the band because she wanted to. McCartney figured, okay, if I'm going to
Right.
start playing live, you're going to learn how to play keyboards because I want you in the band because I want you with me 24/7. The only time they were ever apart was when he
Sweet.
got arrested for the pot thing in Japan.
Oh, I don't know that story.
Oh well, they got busted. There's a bit of a rumor. There's a bit of a rumor that Yoko might have actually done it in a way to just because it was I it's probably not true, but there was a rumor that went around for a long time that she might have done it and tipped the customs off in Japan that they'd probably be traveling with pot, and apparently it was actually Linda's pot, and Paul took the rap, and he went to jail for like
Oh,
either 3 days or a week in Japan,
oh, the
and that was the only
tabloids must
time
have
they
been
were
all over
apart.
that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And so and that's the same thing. And his kids went to regular school. They
Yeah.
never went to any private school. They went to regular old school. And when he went on the road with Wings Over America, I remember the stories where they would be staying in hotel rooms. The kids chambermaids were not allowed into the room, like housekeeping were never allowed into the rooms because the kids were expected to make their beds. They had a tutor on the road. They were expected to make their beds. They were expected to do this, expected to do all that. It was like they had chores. A totally normal family. He did not want the rock star thing whatsoever.
It's like the Obamas when they were in the White House.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Michelle Obama talks about how, she had these teenage daughters, that's a really important formative time. And she was like, I'm not raising my daughters to not make their own beds. No way.
Yeah.
She felt it was really important for their character and, in terms of how they relate to the world, which is to not place oneself above anyone else ever, even if you are the president of the United States daughter
I know.
or a rock star.
I have the utmost respect for the Obamas. I can't
Yeah.
especially all the crap that they faced throughout it, but I don't want to get
Oh,
into that because it just makes my
right.
blood boil. But
Yeah.
anyway, so you started playing jazz. Now you went to college. Did you go to Humber?
I did. Yeah.
And that's a famous, that's like Canada's Berkeley almost.
Well, it is now. At the time, I remember feeling like it was kind of this no-name college and that it was like not at all the level of U of T, like all the really good jazz players went to U of T. That was my perspective, right? And then
Mhm.
the people who couldn't get into U of T, which was a much smaller program, but that was again seen as something prestigious. We all went to the trade school, Humber College, but it has really built up its reputation and now is considered kind of the foremost jazz and music program in Canada. But I loved it. I loved my time there. Maybe because it had a different it was a different environment. The playing field between students and faculty felt a little more level, and in that sense, we could ascend to imagining ourselves out there in the field in a way that maybe other students, where the divide between student and teacher was greater, couldn't. So it actually was a blessing. But yeah, I was going to go to school for sciences. I wasn't even going to go to school for jazz, but I got a scholarship. I was playing again with my left hand at Music Fest, big band festival, high school big band festival. And somebody from Humber was there as an adjudicator and he offered me a scholarship. And I went as a singer because even though they'd never heard me sing a note, I explained that I had this arm injury and they said, well, we'll take you how we can get you. And off I went. And
Wow.
oh,
Isn't that something? So how did you get your right arm back?
how did I get to?
Were you actually, because you say you were playing left hand for a long time. How
Oh,
long was it?
yes. Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Yeah,
Yes.
sorry.
So you know what, Mick, it's funny. It was when I stopped doggedly pursuing solutions to the right arm issue and stopped focusing on it and obsessing over it so much that it just got better. It's just such a bizarre thing. It makes me think about the connection between the mind and the body, and that, as I was relentlessly pursuing answers and treatments, it almost put too much focus on the injury. And when I finally just kind of went, you know what, it just is what it is. and got into singing and got into arranging and composition as other, ways to express myself as a musician. My arm just eventually came around, got caught up, and then it, just got fully integrated into what I was doing and who I was as a jazz musician. And jazz was like learning a new language anyway. So it was like my arm had time to catch up because I had to slow down so much just to learn this new language, that it wasn't like the arm itself was such a huge setback, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That does make sense. Now, you talked earlier, there's Berkeley in the States. What's the other school? The big one.
Do you mean for jazz or for
Juilliard?
Juilliard. Yeah.
So now would you say Berkeley and Juilliard are sort of the same sort of, like you said, U of T and Humber? Would you sort of, is that sort of the same sort of thing?
Yes, that's the perfect analogy. And I don't know if it would hold true today, but certainly, 20 years ago when I was a student, that was absolutely the right comparison, because Juilliard was kind of uppity and like really hard to get into. It was a super small program, like a handful of students. And Berkeley was a trade school. It was like where people went to learn not only how to play jazz, but all kinds of styles of music. And people, didn't reject those other styles of music either. In fact, it was seen as an important part of building your toolkit as a player.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's reputedly the what's his name, the guy that played harmonica with Blues Traveler. Reputedly, he got into Juilliard with a harmonica.
Who is that?
I can't remember his name, but he is
not
brilliant.
William...
He's a brilliant harmonica player, whatever you call it, harmonicist.
Yes.
But apparently he got into Juilliard with a harmonica. The only one that's ever done that.
Is he? I'm wondering if he's the guy who was who dated Madeleine Peru for a while. I think my Willie something. No, it's ringing a bell. But
it's okay. Charles
is on it. Yeah.
Get on it, Charles.
Charles is our guy.
What was his name again, Nick?
Yeah, it'll be the band is Blues Traveler, so I want to know the lead singer or harp player for Blues Traveler. Now, you talked about, we can go on while he's doing that, when you talked about sciences, so you had other interests. What do you think you would be doing if you weren't a musician?
I think I would probably be a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist. My sister's a doctor, and I, especially with the arm injury, I became very interested in sciences and healing and the mind, how the mind ties in with the body. And so I actually got a 4-year scholarship to UBC for sciences, with a focus in psychology.
Wow.
And so my parents... when I went to Humber College for jazz instead, my dad, no. But he thought, they thought I was just doing it for a year. I was told I could defer the scholarship for a year and then go and do the 4 years at UBC and not lose any ground. But in fact, I decided to stay in jazz, which I don't even think I saw that coming, I
find it amazing. You were talking earlier about your mother listening to nothing but CBC Radio 2, but it reminded me at the time, you actually had a show on Radio 2, didn't you?
I still do.
You still do?
Yeah. So it's called CBC Music now, formerly CBC Radio 2. And I'm their jazz show. So it's called Saturday Night Jazz. They named it and branded it. They wanted to make it really clear, like Saturday Night Blues. And I think I'm on at the same time as Randy, but on CBC Music when he's on Radio 1.
Wow.
So every Saturday, 8 p.m. to midnight.
Wow, that's amazing. So Charles found out his name is John Popper.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Now, I don't know, maybe Charles can actually research that too and find out if he actually went to Juilliard.
It was actually the New School for Jazz and Contemporary Music.
Oh, New School. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so it was a little bit embellished. Yeah, he went to Mars by car.
Right, exactly. Isn't that what? Perseverance or whatever it's doing now? Isn't that just a car? Yeah, car to Mars.
So you went to New York. Now, the roommate you had in New York when you got the call from Sting, were they involved in music as well, or?
Nope. Nope.
Oh, okay.
I can't even recall. I think that was a Craigslist thing. Like, I think I found her, the way you do when you're in New York City. I mean, my first time in New York living there was at a nunnery. I mean, I ended up in a convent in the cloisters in Inwood, New York, because I couldn't find anywhere to stay. And so, somebody told me, well, you can get a little room, which was like a cell, but there were all these nuns from the Dominican Republic, and they would say, querida, they call me querida. And it was so funny because there was a 9 p.m. curfew. And I thought, well, this isn't very helpful for an aspiring jazz musician. But there I was, living in a nunnery for about a month when I was first in New York, way back in 2003. It was November of 2003. So, yeah.
Well, but they'd already cleaned up Times Square by that time. So
yeah.
It wasn't.
Oh, it was a different place.
It wasn't as bad. My first time in New York was actually it wasn't that long ago. It was 2007, and I love New York.
You're kidding.
I love it. My first time there was 2007, but I remember hearing the stories before with Times Square was nothing but porno places and
and hookers.
Yeah.
Yep.
They cleaned it up quite a bit.
Giuliani.
Yeah, that's probably the only thing he ever did that was good, I think. Okay, I don't want to get political. So anyway, now the thing about New York, I remember you could be at 2, 3 in the morning. You could walk through Times Square and you'd be perfectly safe. And people were friendly. I remember walking down the street one time and I was looking for something. And I saw these 2 businessmen with briefcases dressed in the nines, the Armani suits, and they're animated in conversation. And I said, hey, I'm looking for this. And they stopped and the guy talked to me for a good 5 minutes. Broke up his conversation with the guy, says, hold on. Says, okay, this is what you do. And he goes through the whole thing. I went, this is that terrible New York where people would rather tell you to FO than, give you the time of day. Sir, I loved it. I thought it was an amazing city.
It is such a warm and, again, life-giving city. People, I know it's very different during pandemic, but everywhere you turned, whether you like it or not, someone wanted to chat, and it could be about anything. It could be politics.
Yeah.
It could be what the coffee was like at that place, or, it could be where you do your laundry. Like, it just, everybody, I think there was something about being in that city together, and there was almost a built-in kinship. Just in living and surviving in New York City, no matter what your socioeconomic class, it was like all those divides came down. We were just people, New Yorkers, trying to make a go of it together, and tourists would be brought into that fold.
I think 9/11 helped out a lot. I really think I brought everything down. So Scott, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. So did you find, Laila, as an import into the New York scene, were they very accommodating and open to people from other parts of the world, and embraced you as part of their own, or was that hard to break into, or
No, instantly. Toronto was more difficult to break into, even from within the city, like as someone who had gone to college in Toronto. And I mean no disrespect towards my fellow Torontonians who I love. But New York, like I said, there was just this camaraderie right out of the gate. And I think people know and remember that they once needed that, because very few New Yorkers are actually from New York originally, right? And so there's just this wonderful help thy neighbor, or do unto others as you would have done unto yourself ethos. And so I just was embraced immediately without reservation. And it doesn't mean... Did
you find that there was even another subculture because you're an artist, and that whole community gives another level to that, or?
Sure, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Because, I think that artists, of course I'm biased, but I think they're sort of the lifeblood of any city, but especially a city like New York. And we would band together all the more powerfully, right? Because it was even harder for us to make a go of it, just by virtue of how expensive New York is. And
I remember you talking about the
notoriously
$50. I remember you making $50 for a night, but that also included three rehearsals leading up to it. And it reminded me, one thing I did notice about New York, and I think it's true right up until a certain level, almost like where you're at a major TV level, where you would walk down the street and there's comedians selling tickets to their shows that night, because that's how they make their money.
Wow.
So these comedians are actually out there selling tickets, and because generally comedy shows, there'll be a headliner, but basically every comedian gets 15 minutes leading up to the headliner. So you'll have, let's say, 6 comedians all along the streets peddling tickets for these shows for $5-10, whatever it is, just to get people in the door so that they can actually make a living.
It's the great equalizer. Like, everybody, if you're in New York, you're in the trenches hustling. And perhaps in varying degrees, or to varying degrees, but everybody, if whether you're Sting or Laila Biali or Lisa Fisher or whatever, it's like you've got to hustle. If you're in New York, you have to hustle.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I luckily when I was there, I was working already, so I didn't have to hustle. But I sure loved the whole experience of it. It was just like everywhere you turned, it's just so vibrant. You don't. Boom. You don't. I mean, it's a city that never sleeps. You don't want to sleep. It's like, I'd walk to Central Park and I'd walk down to Times Square. I remember I took the subway everywhere until I realized that I could actually walk. I could walk to Times Square, to Central Park, to Soho, all that stuff, and just walk and walk to the World Trade Center site, and and Century 21, the best clothing store on earth.
Right, for discounts.
Oh,
I know,
my God.
totally. Well, and it's funny, Mick, because and Scott, it's like New York, everything you just described, which is, are the qualities that make it so beautiful and unlike any other city. Those are also the things that can make it untenable for people. The like constant stimulation, the like not wanting to sleep, it being normal to, maybe not these days, but show up at work or a gig with 102-degree temperature, because you just had to do it. And everybody there, I feel like that line between work and play was always blurred, which in my opinion is mostly a wonderful thing. But it did mean that people would just push themselves to often an unhealthy degree. And I think it's taken me 5 years of living, more full time in Toronto to kind of touch base with, and initially I really wasn't happy here. For the first 2 years, I laugh because I took up coffee when I moved to Toronto, because Toronto felt so sleepy to me compared to New York. I needed a stimulus, and now I'm trying to like break the addiction to coffee. But there was just this need for stimulation, whereas New York, it was like the stimuli were there 24/7.
Well, I live in Victoria now, because when I met Kelly and we got married, and she was from here, and Kelly can't stand Vancouver because she figures it's way too much hustle and bustle, and,
right.
and Vancouver is nothing compared to Toronto. Toronto's nothing compared to New York. It's like, holy smokes. But that's a whole different thing. I mean, Kelly would go to New York and love it, because she's going there as a tourist. But to live there, I don't think she'd like it.
Yeah, a lot of people will say that. You'll hear that distinction. New York is a great place to visit, but there's also a saying, once you've lived there, I think those of us who lived there and really loved it, where New York was like in our bones and in our DNA, there's that expression, you can take the person or the boy or the gal out of New York, but you can't take New York out of the boy or the gal or the person. I mean, it really is true. It's still in my bones to this day. And we've kind of through the past few months, we've definitely really put down roots in a meaningful way in Toronto that we even kind of didn't expect to some degree. And I think for Ben and I, we were like, oh wow, like it was always in the back of our heads that we might move back down to New York. But you know what's funny? Our son hates it. So he loves the memories of his friends and family members, like cousins-in-law in New York. But when we moved to Toronto, you know, we live in a part of the city that's like feels kind of suburban. And even though it's not, it's very close to the city center. But we would go to like the little strip in our neighborhood where there are businesses and restaurants, and it's like very clean. It's not at all that densely populated. And Josh would always go, "Mom, I don't want to go to the city. The city's dirty."
Right.
And I realized that the poor kid, in a way, because he was hauled all over creation day in and day out when we were living in New York, in spite of himself. He didn't have a choice in the matter. I think it kind of mildly traumatized him, because he talks a lot about like New York being so dirty, and it's like, what for him, that's a big takeaway. And the homelessness, like those things really affected him. And I'm hoping that ultimately that makes him a more balanced and compassionate human being as he gets older. But it's just so interesting what people's impressions are of a city like New York.
Well, no matter the size of the city in Canada, you never see the trash piled on the streets for garbage pickup like you do in New York. That was that was one of my takeaways, is just the piles of garbage from every business, and it's incredible.
And then imagine a garbage strike. Like they've had a couple of garbage strikes over the years. I mean, in the dead of summer, can you imagine?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Unbelievable. So one thing I don't know if it just didn't connect in my brain, and you already told me, but I have to ask this again. So you went to Humber. So you were accepted from Humber. You got a scholarship to go to Humber. You went there, and then you went to New York from there? Or did you go back to Vancouver before that, or was?
Oh, well, so I had, I told you I was struggling with mental health. I really hit a low when I was in my early 20s. And so at one point I did go back to Vancouver. Sometimes depending on your relationship with family, for me, it was a positive one. So going home to my parents in Vancouver meant having them kind of dote on me and cook for me and help support me. So I was there for a few months at one point, but otherwise was living in Toronto. And then I got a Canada Council grant to study in New York. And that coincided with, I had opened for Chris Botti across Canada, and then was asked to join his band. And he had the same manager, Bobby Colomby, who played drums with Blood, Sweat, and Tears.
Blood, Sweat, and Tears, yeah. I loved his drumming. Yeah, he was great.
So he was, at this point, really producing a lot more than, he certainly was producing far more than he was playing and producing and also managing. So he managed and produced both Chris Botti and Paula Cole. He was kind of bringing Paula back to the music industry after 7 years of kind of, in the wilderness for her. And so I was touring with Chris. I had replaced his singer, which was so weird to me. And then Bobby and I met in LA on one of those gigs. And it was then that he pitched me to Paula, because he felt like it would be really healthy for her to have another female in the band. And
so it's Bobby Colomby who got you that gig?
Yeah.
Isn't that bizarre? I've always wanted to meet him. I don't know why. Even back in the Blood, Sweat, and Tears days, when I used to love that album as a little kid, there was something about him that I wanted to meet. And that was way before he was in the business. Like he's
He's totally magnetic. He's a very big magnetic personality. Like, a little bit like David Foster. And funnily enough, I played a gig with Paula at an event that was coordinated by Bobby and David Foster together. So there they were sitting in the theater, and I'm there with Paula's band, and Chris Botti was there with his band, and a new singer that was brought into the fold. And Bobby made a lot happen, and he actually wanted me. I've told this story in other interviews. He set up a meeting between me, Tal Wilkenfeld, the young bassist.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And Vinny Colaiuta. So I met with the two of them. He wanted to start, and I say this with so much humility because I am not the level of player of Vinny or Tal, but he wanted to start this kind of super group or what he thought of, like he was trying to launch me. And so he had this vision of me kind of being like a Hiromi, you know, where it's like this uber fusion jazz player with Vinny on drums and Tal on bass. And it didn't take off because I ultimately didn't buy into the idea. And it's not because I didn't hugely respect those two players and admire them, and, you know, wouldn't it be in my wildest dreams to work with them? But it just wasn't what I saw for myself. I just knew even then that that wasn't who I was as a musician, even though I loved that music. Like I loved listening to Mike Stern and who's the guy in New York, Wayne Krantz, like this kind of uber jazz fusion music, but it wasn't me.
He wasn't drumming with Sting on the tour you were on, was he?
No, but actually he asked me to play in his band. You know, the project I did with Sting was very unique, and it was almost more classical leaning. But then he asked me to play a gig with his band in Ecuador, and that would have been with Vinny Colaiuta. Right. And I couldn't do it because I had a gig with my own band in Japan, and I was contracted and couldn't get out of it. And there were a few times over the years that Sting asked if I would join him in like his real band, and I just couldn't make it happen, which was a bummer. But
wow.
You know,
well, it's nice to know that once you're in his fold, you're always part of his Rolodex. That's a nice thing to know.
He is very much that way when you're, and it's like a family, you know. I mean, I will say that you can never take for granted that that you're like in the family to stay if you don't kind of keep your chops up. And Sting is somebody who is known for putting his musicians kind of through the fire and expecting a lot of them. So I remember, you know, in 2015 playing some shows with him when he was doing The Last Ship. And that music is complicated, especially for the piano chair.
That's the stuff he wrote that were like, it was like English folk music stuff,
that's
right?
It. And it's complicated harmonically.
It's like he wrote it on a lute or something. It was like a really odd bunch of music. Really like 17th century stuff.
It's Northumbrian. So he's from Newcastle.
Right.
And, you know, and so he grew up with all this very sophisticated kind of Northumbrian folk music, but then he has all this rigorous sort of training and background himself as a musician. So we'd be in sound check and we'd be playing this song that was cycling through all these different keys, and my piano part was very specific. And then he'd go, could we try it in this key? And I would be like, oh my gosh. And on the spot, you know, minutes from showtime, I'd be transposing on the fly.
Where's the transpose twitch?
Well, yeah, there's no capo for the piano. So it was just like, you know, it really kept me on my toes. But I think it was partly what kept me, you know, kind of in his orbit as a prospective musician that he would perhaps call on from time to time.
That's nice to know.
Yeah.
And so not only, so you were playing keyboards with him and singing.
Yeah, exactly. So first I was just singing, and then he discovered I was a piano player. And I'll never forget, I was playing backstage. It was at the Durham Cathedral where we filmed If on a Winter's Night, the DVD. And I found a piano and I was playing, and he came up behind me, put his hands on my shoulder, and he said, "Darling, so that's what you do." And it was like, you know, my secret was out, because even though I was with him as a singer, and I hope had earned my place in that capacity, I think he got the sense, okay, this is sort of this musician's true character and foundation is as a piano player. And he was right about that. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
That's so cool. So out of Sting, what happens at that point? Is that when you start pursuing your own deal? Now, actually, hold it. Let's go back to when you met your husband. When you met, so that was Paula. Now, Paula was before Sting.
Yeah, 2007. So when you were in New York, that was when I was cutting my teeth with Paula and had met Ben.
Okay. And so, and you were on tour with Sting when?
2009.
2009. So by then you and Ben are obviously an item. Everything's
we were pregnant.
So you were pregnant on tour with Sting?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, I know that your partners, if you have kids of your own, or, if you're uncles, you may have heard some stories about what can happen during pregnancy, but I'll never forget getting my first kind of bout of morning sickness on the train on the way to doing the View. It was The View. And we were doing promotional dates with Sting, and I remember just beelining for the donuts. And I'm gluten-free, dairy-free, and I saw those donuts. I beelined to everything inside of me, went, "You need a donut." And I went and I started scarfing donuts. And a lot of what causes morning sickness is blood sugar issues. So that was why my body said, you need that and you need it now. So I'm scarfing donuts, and then, we're called onto the set, and I got through, but it was so funny. Nobody knew I was pregnant. And it was in December. So I started working with him in August, and Ben and I got pregnant in September. And the joke was, Sting would just, because he loves to rib people, and, he's such a stud, right? So when people would ask who Ben was, my now husband, Sting would go, "He's the father of my baby." And so anyway, so I nobody knew until December that I was pregnant. And it was so funny. Sting had a stylist, Robert Malner, and who would outfit us for all these shows, and especially for anything that was being filmed for Sting's purposes, right? And we were getting fitted for a big show at St. John the Divine, I think it's called, and that it's a huge cathedral in New York. And I was 3 months pregnant at this point, and Robert very tactfully went, "Laila, the measurements you gave me, in August have changed." That's my son in the background. Sorry. So, and then it was at that point that Joe Laurie, who was singing background vocals with Sting, pulled me aside, and she was reading between the lines, and she was like, "Are you pregnant?" And so the cat was out of the bag. And then I told Sting, and I'll never forget his reaction. He said this verbatim. He said, "Laila, how wonderful. Wonderful for us all." And it was like, he didn't care. He was so happy to have me there, pregnant and in the mix. And and when Josh was born, 6 weeks after Josh was born, in June of 2010, Sting came through Toronto with his Symphonicities tour. And they were playing the Molson Amphitheater, and he'd sent us a onesie for Josh, a little Sting onesie. And so I put Josh in the onesie, and I was side stage, and this is such a sweet memory for me.
Oh, I bet.
I was side stage. It was the thick of summer in Toronto, just humid, and little Josh is melting in his snuggly, and Sting is on stage with an orchestra, and Joe Laurie's there, and a lot of people that I had worked with as part of If on a Winter's Night, Ira Coleman on bass, and Sting in between songs would come side stage and rub Josh's back and say things like, "Babies have the best energy," and he was just like delighting in this new chapter in my life, and the way that it kind of intermingled with working with him. And yeah, it was like, I was always in the fold and always part of that family, and still am. So that's
beautiful.
Sting.
That's just so beautiful. That's amazing. So, okay, so I got to pull you out. This is like my heart's going here. So now I got to pull you out of the Sting thing.
Yeah.
And so when do you start pursuing your career like the way it is now? Because you had a jazz band. I think did you not release an album when you lived in Vancouver at one point?
Not in Vancouver, but I released my first kind of commercial release was in 2005, called Introducing the Laila Biali Trio. And then I released another one when I was opening for Chris Botti. And then I released a CD with CBC Records when they existed. And that was kind of my first major release that put me on the map nationally. And that was called From Sea to Sky. That was in 2008 that it released.
I called some pictures. We'll pull them up later and you can comment on them.
So. Oh, wow. Okay. So, and this is kind of a sweet story. So we get pregnant and, you know, it kind of rocked our worlds. Like, I remember, you know, I shouldn't give too much information, but being in Toronto and taking the test and, you know, it was unexpected. And I see that, you know, that second pink line and running into a pharmacy and saying like, what is this? What is happening? You know? And there's a woman behind the counter that said, is it good news or bad news? And through tears, I said, I don't know. You know, and she said,
I'm on tour with Sting.
That was literally what I said. She said, how old are you? And I said, I'm 29. And she said, very good age to have baby. And then I said, but I'm on tour with Sting. And it was sort of like, I just knew that it would be a game changer, you know? And in the end, of course, it was a game changer. I wouldn't change for anything. You know, Josh has brought more richness and beauty into our world than I ever dared imagine. But at that time, I was like, oh, this is the end of my career. So what did we do? We decided, let's make a record because the clock is ticking. And so I wrapped up with Sting in December of 2009. And here's a fun little side story. We were still living in New York, and Ben was actually approached about doing the Symphonicities tour.
Wow.
But and it was his dream equally to work with Sting, but he said no because it was going to overlap with the birth of Josh. And
oh my God.
Yeah, and he was like, I'll be darned.
What a quality guy.
Super quality guy. And so, you know, for the remainder of my pregnancy, we wrapped up my next record, Tracing Light, and when I went to record vocals, and let me tell you, I mean, as that things are expanding, it becomes more and more difficult to sing. Any singer will tell you that, right? That babe is
nothing like using your diaphragm with somebody else trying to use it.
That's right.
Yeah.
A little bit of crowding, like living in a New York apartment together.
Yeah.
And so the babe is, you know, taking up all the space. But when I went into the studio and started recording vocals, it was Josh's first kicks. And it was like I was in there in the studio and it was like he was cheering for me, like, okay, go mom, you know. And so we got that album done, and then within months of his being born, we were touring that album, and I just had this illusion that I would strap Josh onto my person and go all over creation with him. You know, we had friends in New York who had what I call magic jazz babies. And they would put the baby into a sling on stage and put the Peltor headphones on the baby's head. And the baby would just, you know, be on stage with that singer for the gig, not making a peep. Josh was not that child. Josh was colicky. But I tried kind of foolishly to, you know, ignore his needs because I just was so determined to keep touring. And eventually Ben and I, you know, we determined that, okay, we got to divide and conquer. Like one of us needs to stay home with the babe while the other goes out on the road, and we'll tag team and we'll each try not to be away for more than 2 weeks at a time. We kind of arbitrarily put that as the boundary because we didn't want to be away from our child for weeks on end.
Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah, and so it became this dance, this little tango, you know. But to answer your question, Mick, in a way, Josh's arrival solidified my reconnecting with who I was as an artist and who I wanted to be in the world as an artist, because I wouldn't at that point go out for months-long tours with other people like Sting, or I was asked to do a couple of other big tours. One was with Josh Groban, and I just, you know, it just wasn't an option. And yeah, so that was how we started to really dig into back into my creative and my own artistic endeavors.
So how many albums do you have out in total now, including your original trio album?
I have to count. I think it's 8. So Introducing the Laila Biali Trio, Laila Live, Sea to Sky, Tracing Light, Live in Concert, House of Many Rooms, Laila Biali. Yeah, Out of Dust is the 8th.
Sea to Sky, was that like an inspiration of that whole North Shore thing?
Yep. It was my kind of my ode to Canada and growing up in Vancouver. And actually, funnily enough, Mick, you asked if I had made one of those albums in Vancouver. Well, I didn't record From Sea to Sky in Vancouver, but I was actually compiling the music. I was asked to cover songs from mainstream Canadian artists and arrange them for a jazz ensemble. So Bruce Cockburn, Sarah McLachlan, and Mark Jordan. And I was taking CDs out of the West Vancouver Public Library and choosing songs, like listening to 10 Katie Lang records and 10 Bruce Cockburn records and choosing my favorite to feature on that record. And I'm sure the From Sea to Sky Highway, which was just down the road from my parents' home, was kind of right there, you know.
You mentioned Katie Lang, probably the most incredible voice ever to come out of anywhere.
I could not agree with you more.
Constant Craving, that song, Constant Craving, melts me every time I hear it. I've never heard a song to me that just completes me more than that song.
The album for me is Hymns from the 49th Parallel. That to me is the one.
Is that the one she did a Hallelujah one on?
Yes, she's covering Jane Siberry and Leonard Cohen and oh, that voice, it's like velvet, you know.
Well, her take on Hallelujah at the Junos that year. I mean, like nobody's ever done that. I mean, good.
I'm in
Lord.
agreement. I'm in agreement. And I love Jeff Buckley's version and I love, you know, but to me, Katie's is the one.
She owned it. She totally owned that song. It was like, it became her song. It was like, but she seems like that. She seems to be like that with everything. You know, I've never heard such beauty and pitch and phrasing, you know, it's just unbelievable.
And she's a jazz fan. So my friend, Cody Hutchinson, who is a bassist out of Calgary, but he also helps run and curate the YYC Jazz Festival. And he also is president of the label Chronograph that my last couple of albums are out on. He tells the story of chatting with Katie Lang by phone fairly recently, and it had something to do with jazz, and she is a jazz fan herself, which always delights me when I hear that, you know.
Yeah, I know. I've only met her a couple of times, but it was sort of being in the same vicinity, not so much actually meeting her.
Yeah, like at the same festival or something.
No, it wasn't that actually. It was actually in the back alley in Vancouver, and I think it was a Triumph. Somebody pulls up on a Triumph, decked out in leathers and stuff, and I just assumed it was a guy. And you know, and off comes the helmet, and it's Katie Lang. And it was, and also in my mind's eye, this may not have happened, but I swear to God, this is what happened in my mind's eye. It was like, "How you doing?" That might not have happened, but it might have happened too. And then another time, I was before a gig, and there was a pub nearby. We went to eat at a pub, and she was coming out with a friend, and they were both half cut. She was walking by. I went, "Oh my God, I love Ingenue." She goes, "Thanks." Oh, that was about it. My big meeting with Katie Lang. Yeah,
well, it's human. It makes them human, right? It's like, right, everybody. I mean, they're people. I mean, they're down to. Not everybody is like this, and that's to Katie and Sting's credit, right? Is they're so down to earth, right?
Yeah. Well, and you know, McCartney too. I mean, you hear all these things. I mean, I've never really met McCartney. Like once in his vicinity, he said something to me, but I couldn't answer because I was like, but. But the thing is, when he talked, like you hear interviews with David Grohl, and David Grohl says, like the first thing says, McCartney knows who he is. So the first thing he's going to try to do with you is diffuse that. He's going to try to make you feel at ease so that he can be at ease. because
Yeah.
the further along that whole stigma is that you're in the room with Paul McCartney, the worse it makes it for him. So he wants to get you off the hook. You know?
Yes, I felt that with Sting as well. And one of the things I did realize fairly early on, and I'm not going to lie, I still struggle with it. Like when I went and saw him at that theater, I mean, I hold my body differently. I'm sort of holding my breath because it's Sting, and I will forever be a fangirl. But I really sensed that in order to hang with him and be in his band, like you had to kind of let your guard down. And I'll never forget seeing Lisa Fisher jump onto his lap at one time backstage, and not in a scandalous or, lewd way, but it was very playful. And I was like, now there's a gal who toured with the Stones for 25 years, and she's just totally comfortable kind of playing with Sting and having fun with him. And I could see his delight in that because he's so used to everybody's backs being up around him. And he doesn't want that because, as you said, as you so well articulated, they can't be at ease when they sense that you're not at ease, right? So
exactly. Well, we've had a fantastic interview with you.
Wow. That half hour just went so quick.
Yeah.
I know, longest half hour of my life. No, I'm joking.
Thank you so much from all of us here at your Backstage Pass.
Aw, thanks for having me.
You, Laila.
Scott, and hey, Charles and John and Dylan behind the scene, and Mick, of course. Thank you so much to all of you for having me.
So much fun.
Can't wait to see you down the road somewhere.
Likewise.
All right.
Take care. Thanks for joining us. Check out our many other episodes and vignettes for more great content. And please like, share, and subscribe, and become a member at SocialNRGPresents.com to access all our content and earn valuable energy points just for watching.